Welcome to the Internet History Podcast. I'm your host, Brian McCullough. Since I was unable to release an episode last Monday, and I will be out of town for the holidays next week, I'm going to release this one today, on Friday, literally 15 minutes after recording it, to sort of split the difference for you. This is sort of a makeup episode for last Monday, and also this will be kind of the de facto episode for this Monday. I will hopefully have a new episode for you again the first week of December. To today's episode. I don't think very many people 20 years ago would have imagined that maps, or location technology in general, would prove to be so strategically important and structurally integral to the internet and modern technology in general, as we're coming to know it, as it actually turns out it has been. And one person who might have had that vision that location technology would be so influential was Barry Glick, the founding CEO of MapQuest. Barry was there in the very early days when maps and computers first met, and he has stayed in the location tech industry through the emergence of GPS, mobile devices, and now into the current future of driverless cars and the like. I literally couldn't think of a better person to tell us the whole story of the emerging mapping technology from the earliest web to today. It's really a fascinating story that I think has been, as I say, severely underreported, or at least a little bit underreported. But to fill in all of the excellent details, please enjoy this excellent conversation with Barry Glick. Barry Glick, thanks for coming on the Internet History Podcast.
Sure. I'm excited to be here.
So we always get started by asking people a little bit about, their educational background and things like that. And for you, it's especially important because, among other things, you have a PhD in geography.
Correct.
So my question would be, when you get a PhD in geography, would this be in the early 80s?
That's right. Yep.
When you have that degree,
81, I believe.
When you have that degree in 1981, what are you thinking that you're going to be able to do with it?
Well, that's a good question. That same question my parents asked me. And kind of a funny little factoid is that fewer students enter university, at least in the United States, knowing they're going to major in geography than any other subject except for anthropology.
Wow.
So at least we're not last, we're next to last. But, and this part of my story, I hear a lot from other people too, so I know it's not unique, but, I was one of those kids who was a total map head. I got in trouble in elementary school for using a sharp point of a pen or something to gouge out maps on my desk, my classroom desk. I, always was obsessed with, and I say obsessed with maps. I did not know, where that would lead. As I'm sure if you keep going and end up with a PhD or go through that program, of course your advisors, professors hope that you're going to move into an academic career. So, that was the direction I was headed. Geography, while it is not the most popular discipline, there are a decent number of universities that still teach it and have jobs. But I also had a practical kind of background because I also got a master's in city planning from Cornell along the way. And during that time, I spent a lot of time in something that was relatively new called computer graphics. And I always thought that, hey, this is perfect for mapping, obviously, the graphical aspect of it, to automate it or digitize it. So, I took a large number of computer science classes, as well as my geography classes. So I was hoping I could do something that somehow brought those two together. I was lucky enough to be able to do that. So I started out in kind of the first step of an academic career, decided that that was not going to be the direction I wanted to go, and was entrepreneurial, and started out working for a small company, and then started my own.
Well, before we get to spatial data sciences, just lay out the land for us in a sense. I mean, even by the mid '80s, graphics on computers, personal computers at least, are not very good. I mean, Silicon Graphics comes out with higher end workstations that can handle graphics and things like that. But so lay out for us, as in the '80s, I'm assuming mapping and geography and things like that come together with computing. Like, what are some of the things that people are starting to explore as those two things intersect?
Well, from a mapping point of view, and I think it's useful to think of this in two different kind of domains. One is kind of coming at it from the graphics angle of it, which is the visualization part of it, which is cartography. From a map academics point of view. So that's the one side. The other side is the data and analytics part of it, which is the quote geography part of it, which later on kind of morphs into something called geographic information systems, about managing the data, handling the data, manipulating it, and then you've got the visualization piece. So on the visualization side, you're absolutely right. There were specialized devices. I mean, we started from a, first of all, we still thought, at least initially, hard copy was the most important form of output. So, devices that produced hard copy, and literally, of course, the first that I had experience with was a, basically an alphanumeric line printer, and somebody who was quite bright created a program written in Fortran or COBOL or something like that created maps from line printer using line printer graphics, which were literally overprinting of letters, numbers, and symbols in a way that produced a shaded kind of black and white map just using a line printer. And we thought, hey, this is pretty cool. And obviously, very, very crude. There were some plotters, that could produce, of course, fine lines and vectors, and those were primarily found in kind of specialized engineering drawing and related kind of application areas. And then on what was called the soft copy side, or the display side, we started out with Tektronix displays. And the interesting thing about Tektronix displays, was that they're true vector displays, which fits more naturally into kind of how cartography is stored and managed and kind of was drawn by human beings, which is drawn as lines, not drawn as rasters. So the Tektronix displays, which were black and white, or more accurately green and white displays, were used to create at least the first maps on screens that I was used to seeing. And of course, these were not color, and as I said, they were vector drawings. So that's kind of, at least in my experience, how kind of my first exposure.
How things evolved.
Yeah. That was back in the 80s, in the early 80s or mid 80s.
So you did mention that you got an entrepreneurial streak and you started a company called Spatial Data Sciences. Can you tell me what that company was designed to do?
Sure. And just as kind of background, that wasn't my first gig.
Okay, if I'm skipping things, please, feel free to.
No. That was sort of my jumping off point entrepreneurially, but I started out working for other people, which I kind of had to do to make some money. And I worked for a couple of companies that were developing some of the early, I'll call them applications of computer mapping and geographic data. For example, company that I worked with in Boston developed a little business around drawing very high quality maps for insurance companies and marketing firms that wanted to get a geographic visualization of the data. For example, the success of direct marketing campaigns, and look at kind of where the responses were coming from and where they weren't coming from, and getting a very quick view of it through a high quality map that could be shown on a boardroom. So we used a very high quality plotter, and we created this and charged them several hundred or thousands of dollars, and we kind of developed this into a little bit of a business. So I did that for a couple of different companies. I moved down to Washington, D.C. Right at the start of the 80s, and if people remember back in those days, we elected a new president in the United States, Ronald Reagan, around that time, and a lot of money started pouring into defense, and there was a lot of interest in the early 80s around all the kind of various aspects of computer mapping, let's say, in terms of being able to interpret maps and aerial photographs, digitize them, store them, retrieve them, display them, transmit them, analyze them, etc. So, they were that money that was coming into some of the technology companies in those days, was being used to kind of advance the state of the art. So I got involved. I was hired by a company to run a group which was based down in Virginia, that had funding from different government agencies to do some of this stuff. So I did that, and I thought, hey, this is kind of cool. But I think there are applications outside of defense and government that could benefit from the technology. So that was the impetus to start Spatial Data Sciences, was basically, and in fact, I was extremely fortunate because there was a Business Week article written about Spatial Data Sciences shortly after it was formed, because they decided to do an article on this new technology of digital mapping, and I happened to know they interviewed one of the government agencies, U.S. Geological Survey, which is responsible for civilian mapping in the United States. They interviewed them and asked them, who's doing this stuff, and they mentioned my name. So I kind of got my picture in Business Week as a startup, and the headline was something like, moving computer mapping from government to business, or something like that.
Well, that's
kind of our tagline.
Let me interrupt real quick, because for our purposes,
please.
That's really interesting to me, because in the 80s, you have this notion that, for lack of a better word, this new digital mapping technology could have consumer, or at least I suppose commercial, applications.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, and so tell me what Spatial Data Sciences actually did. Okay,
so what Spatial Data Sciences actually did was created or developed software, and initially these were custom software projects for companies who had a need to either manage or use data that was geographic in nature, meaning tied to location, essentially. So some examples of what we did was, for example, we wrote software to do redistricting of legislative districts, which obviously uses geographic data, demographic data, other kinds of data, and helps do kind of what if analysis of different types of different arrangements of districting. And that the natural sort of analog of that on the commercial side was sales territory design. So we did for a major pharmaceutical firm, Pfizer. We built with a partner of ours. We built a sales territory optimization software package. We also added computer mapping to the airline reservation systems. So in those days, those were obviously mainframe-based programs that did, reservation systems, and what some of the travel agents would use these on their desks before there was disintermediation in that business. But travel agents had a need when somebody called up and said, I'm going to a meeting or a convention in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, and I want to stay in a hotel near the convention center. They had no way to kind of know where the hotels, were located. There was no, Google Maps or MapQuest to look this stuff up. So, we put it right at the terminal of the travel agent through the airline reservation system. So that's the kind of thing. We did the same thing with real estate, for real estate agents to have maps on their screens. So we were basically putting maps on people's screens, and before the days of PCs, or certainly before the time of the web, using client server technology was the way to achieve that, and the clients were basically somewhat dumb terminals.
This might be getting out of the chronology a bit, but I have to imagine that briefly CD-ROMs would have been a big part of that as well.
Yeah, so I'm trying to figure out when that came in. Mm-hmm. So I know that I can remember certainly that in the days of spatial data science, we were not in the CD-ROM business, and I don't think CD-ROMs were around in the late 80s, because in 1990, the company that we became Geosystems, which was the company that led to MapQuest, and in that company, in Geosystems, we did a lot of CD-ROM mapping. That was one of the primary things that we did in the early days of that company. So that would have been in the early 90s.
So tell me about Geosystems and bring me into the 90s and bring me to the idea that becomes MapQuest.
Okay, so the thing that led to that sort of got the balls moving or rolling or whatever the right word is, the wheels turning.
Right.
The wheels turning. Right. It was somebody came to me in sometime in 88, 89 time frame, and came in with a what in those days passed for a portable computer, which was really something luggable. And he showed me on his screen. He showed me basically a program that could calculate routes, the best way to get from one city to another city in the United States. Calculate the best route. And I mean, today we think, gee, well, isn't that obvious? Well, no, it wasn't obvious. Right. And he showed it on a screen. It was, a very, very crude map that didn't look like a map. It just looked like a bunch of squiggly spaghetti on the screen. But I said, gee, this is interesting. What do you think the application of this is? And he said, well, automobile clubs. I mean, they have to, they as a service, the AAA and other automobile clubs figure out the best route for people to take, who are club members, and I can automate it. And I said, well, that's interesting. Let's go and talk to the automobile clubs. So we went and talked to all of the automobile clubs, and it turned out that, doing it by hand, which is the way they were doing it, was expensive in terms of people's time and the materials and so on. So we thought, yeah, this makes a lot of sense. So at that point, we decided, rather than develop a custom product for somebody, that we would actually create a product ourselves, and it would be a customized routing and mapping product. So at that point, we thought we needed a partner, and we went around and talked to the mapping companies, the companies that had roadmaps, because part of the idea was to give people something they were used to seeing, which means something that really looks like a roadmap, which meant that we would scan roadmaps, and then the route that was calculated would be overlaid on top of the scanned roadmaps, so that what it looked like the customer got would be a normal roadmap with a highlighted route on top of it to show them the route. So, and that's what the auto clubs really wanted. So we talked to the publishers, which include people like Rand McNally and the others. And one of them, which was not, certainly not the most well-known, but there was a company that had a content library of roadmaps in the United States, was a company called R.R. Donnelley, which happens to be, at that time, the largest printing company in North America. They also did maps. So, to cut kind of a long story short, we entered into a joint venture with them to develop this custom mapping and routing product for the auto clubs and others, and they eventually bought out my partner's shares in Spatial Data Sciences, and I became the CEO of the company that was part of R.R. Donnelley, that was called Geosystems, which obtained the rights to the routing and mapping product.
So where does... actually, let me ask this a different way. So this is probably early to mid-'90s.
That's right.
When do you remember first seeing the web, and more importantly, when does seeing the web and thinking of adding maps to the web sort of come together?
Well, I honestly can't say exactly when I remember first seeing the web. I would guess it was, sometime in 1995. I'm sure you and the people in the audience probably, know those dates a lot better than I can remember.
Right, that would be the time of Netscape and things like that. Sure.
Yeah. So that was the time. We I think from probably from what I just described, and of course when we started Geosystems, I mentioned the auto clubs, but we branched out into many other applications that had a need for mapping and routing delivered digitally through client server networks. And the first, our salespeople who were out on the road carrying along their computers, they had a need for being able to demonstrate our mapping and routing technology. And one approach, of course, is doing something canned. Another approach is to access the servers, which especially in those days, was kind of hit and miss in terms of whether you'd get a modem to sign on correctly, and you'd have the right bandwidth, etc. So that was fraught with risk. And one of our people, and I don't remember who it was, but somebody said, "Hey, the World Wide Web would be a perfect place for us to put up our mapping and routing technology, so that our salespeople, when they're on the road, can just be able to
demo,
log on to the web, and show the maps and routes live and in action." And we thought, hey, that's a fantastic idea. And in fact, let's see if I can remember the first name that we had for this. After we were able, and because of the software that we had developed, which was specifically set up for client server based sort of architectures, it wasn't it fit pretty nicely into the web paradigm of having, kind of a very light client and the server doing the bulk of the work on the back end. So we were able to. I think initially we tried to call it Web Mapper, I believe. And so we, on a date in the early spring of '96, we decided, we'd launch this, and we would, what the hell, we'd open it up for the public, since we thought it was pretty cool, and we didn't see any reason why we wouldn't do it, and we did that, and we got a huge reaction from the public, which of course brought down our servers or single server, and we added more and more servers, and we brought those down, and it just snowballed from that.
So
it was originally set up to be a tool for demoing.
Okay, yeah, that's what I wanted to make clear. So it was originally sort of an internal tool, but you were just like, well, let's just make it available to everybody, and then it turned out that when everybody discovered it, all of a sudden everybody loved it.
Yeah, and part of it was, the kind of great pent up demand for map information and routing. That certainly was there. But another thing which generated a lot of free publicity for us, which people may not realize in terms of the novelty of it, was back in those days when the web was first starting. Basically most websites were a collection of static pages, and in fact, I think some people refer to it kind of as brochureware. You would take a marketing brochure and you would put the pages up on the web, and yes, there was branching, so you could choose some stuff, and it would navigate you through the pages. Our MapQuest from day one, basically did not have any pre-generated pages. Everything was calculated, based on the person's location, so that the map was generated from our servers based on what was around that person's location, whatever address they typed in or whatever route they wanted. So this was an example of the web being used for something dynamic rather than static, and because of that, we got a lot of free publicity and free press.
Right, because what you're saying is that the MapQuest site, you wouldn't go and select a drop-down menu of, let's see, Florida, let's see, Miami. It would be enter in an address, and then you'd get the map generated for you.
Exactly right.
And also, It's interesting to me, you're saying that you launched from day one with the routing feature, because I would have assumed that would have been something that came later.
It's a good question. I do know, and there, I'm sure people who going to correct me on this, but I do know that certainly initially the feature was, the dominant feature was the mapping, not the routing. We considered the routing kind of a trip maker or some specialized feature, and did not initially emphasize it. So it could be that came later. I honestly can't remember the exact chronology, but I do know that it was not initially emphasized. But when we saw the numbers in terms of how people were using the site, and so many great preponderance of users were generating routes, we quickly made sure, because actually the maps and the routes kind of took place on servers. We were able to kind of divide that functionality up that way, so we made sure we added enough servers to handle the calculations that have to be done to calculate routes, because that's what people were using it for.
So let me back up real quick, because we're talking about launching MapQuest as a business, or you're discovering that this can be a business all on its own that faces the consumer. You're getting your data from R.R. Donnelley, right? So that you already have that data. You don't have to go out and find other sources or anything?
No.
Okay.
No, sorry. I kind of confused that with mentioning the
Please explain,
piece.
sure.
Okay. So I'll call it triptych, even though that's really a name that belongs to AAA. But in the Auto Club mapping world, where there's a hard copy produced, we use the R. Donnelley maps as the road maps as a background to have the printed maps appear like an actual road map with the custom route highlighted on top of it. But that's all that was used for, and I'll call it a dumb raster background. Okay. That was not true data. So the data, when in order to calculate a route, you need actual map data in the form of a network, vectors and links and stuff like that. So that did not come from R. Donnelley. And initially, that came from the U.S. government. The Census Bureau had a digital database of the United States of every street paid for by taxpayers' dollars called Tiger. And that was the source of, pretty much anyone who was working in this field back in those days used this data source called Tiger. Now, Tiger was created for demographics, really, and is good for address searching, but not particularly good for route calculation. So some of the basic stuff like one-way streets, was missing. So just about at this same time, a couple of companies appeared who produced routable databases for the U.S., North America, and Europe later on. One of these companies was called Navigation Technologies, which became Navtech, which became part of Nokia,
right,
and is now called HERE, and the other one, which was called, Geographic Data Technologies in the United States, and ETAC. And anyway, there were two companies that did that. So when we got serious about this and launched as a routing service, we became one of the first licensors of this map data from Navigation Technologies, or Navtech.
And now that again, it's becoming a business, and you're facing consumers, and you take on the CEO role. What is the business model that you're imagining? Is it going to be licensing? Is it going to be selling ads? Is it going to be selling subscriptions? What do you do when you start to turn this into a real business?
Okay. Yeah. So, we were, first of all, we were lucky enough or fortunate enough that when we started, of course, we had this client-server mapping business kind of going on, and it was, doing well and generating some profit for us. So that was kind of nice, while the web business models were able to mature. So, we kind of had a three-pronged approach. And I'll start with the weakest one, which never turned out to be a positive contributor, in the early days, let's say, and that was advertising. I mean, there just, at that point, there really wasn't a strong advertising market, and we couldn't sell. We can talk more about this later, but it was difficult to sell all the ad space that we had, we'll put it that way. But what we were able to do successfully is two things. One is to provide a way for companies who wanted to show their own stores or dealers or facilities on a map, and also give people who use the web directions to those stores. We had a way for those people to, as is obviously done so much today using Google Maps and others, for them to, basically rely on our mapping backend, but with their own data and, with their own customers using our mapping backend within their own websites. So that model, worked extremely well, and I think we had, over 2,000 customers or clients who made use of our mapping and routing in that way on their own websites.
And again, these are like travel booking sites or Yellow Pages sites, things like that.
Hotel chains, car dealers, restaurant chains, anyone who had a presence on the web that had multiple locations and wanted to show them on a map and let their customers be able to generate driving directions to them. So that was the second method, and the third one was we actually licensed our software and enabled other websites to basically have their own version of MapQuest on their behind their firewall and on their servers, and that was obviously a much bigger deal, and only a few very large companies did it, like for example Yahoo and some of the other search engines in those days. Who wanted to have mapping on their site licensed our software.
Right. So all of the portals like Excite and Yahoo and those.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
And
yes.
So in that case, it becomes part of that portal arsenal of these are the things that we add, like email, like horoscopes,
right.
Right. But whatever to have utility to keep their users around on their sites.
Yep. Exactly.
So, are there other competitors to you out there at this point? I'm talking about in the mid to late 90s. Are there other people that are competing with you to go after the Yahoos and the Excites and other companies?
Yeah. So in this area of serving other websites and working with the other companies out there that wanted to have mapping and routing on their websites, we did have one primary competitor who's based on the West Coast, and the name of that company was Vicinity Corporation. Mm-hmm. The advantage that we had over them was that they never focused on the consumer facing part of it, and it was kind of similar to the of course the huge advantage that Google has today, which is because their mass market, basically their mass market use means that they can operate at a scale that serving, for example, business users or enterprises, all of the fixed costs are pretty much paid for. They're sitting there with all this capacity to be able to generate maps and routes. So we had so much, we had so many servers to handle our kind of our consumer traffic that our costs of handling the business side of it were the incremental costs were quite low. So we could be very cost competitive, and our competitor Vicinity didn't have that luxury. So I think we were able to. Plus, everybody, of course, at this point, a couple of years after launch, everybody had heard of MapQuest. So we got a lot of B2B business through that, and no one really ever heard of Vicinity.
Right, you have the brand recognition that they don't.
Yeah, so we had the brand recognition, and so they were our main competitor, but they had a comparable product on the B2B side.
So I don't want to give short shrift to MapQuest's story, but I want to bring us towards the turn of the century. But to do that, was in the late 90s, is MapQuest already starting to work with things like PDA makers and mobile companies and things like that, and taking it beyond the web? Are you already doing that in the late 90s?
Yeah, we and you could probably help me here in terms of chronology, but
sure.
I don't recall when Palm Pilot came out.
I don't know the exact year, but there are Palm devices by 97, 98, and 99, okay. Certainly, yeah.
So we had a partnership with Palm for mapping on the Palm Pilot. We also did a really great little project, which talk about what's the expression for when you're too early. You never want to be the
first to the party.
Yeah, but there's a little bit more kind of colorful expression about that, about how you get hurt when you're the first sort of like leading the charge. And we had a really nice little project on the Apple Newton together with Apple and Disney to be a kind of an interactive travel guide to Disney resorts with maps and routes and stuff like that on the Apple Newton. And we thought it was used in some advertising for the Apple Newton by Apple, but that never really took off.
It wasn't long for the world, right?
Handwriting recognition wasn't ready yet at that time. But anyway, so personally, I felt very strongly and said so in whatever forums I was able to speak at, that the natural place for maps and routes and location in general was on a mobile device, because your location is critical when you're moving, and that when things became really mobile, location is would be a absolutely essential capability to have. So we kind of felt, and then it was a matter of waiting for the devices, the operating systems, and the bandwidths to catch up to be able to really have true mobile internet that actually worked. So there were a lot of false starts. And of companies, including ours and others, that tried to a little bit too soon have mapping and routing on mobile devices before there were smartphones.
Well, getting us there. Before we get there, let's just give service to MapQuest. It's sold to AOL in the year 2000, I think. And
yes, correct.
Do you have anything you want to say about like that process, about selling to AOL, about leaving your time at MapQuest, anything like that?
Well, I'll just say, first of all, we went public first in '99, and that was sort of at the height of the bubble and boom. I always felt that unlike some other companies, I mean, we were not, and our, the investment bankers and others actually criticized us. We were not a pureplay.com, because we had significant B2B and other business outside of our MapQuest.com activity. So,
AKA, you had a real business model.
We had a real business, and the .com business became a real business as well. But we had other things. So we weren't a pure play.com. So in terms of valuations, we did very, very well. But we weren't as high as some of the other pure plays. But we did not fall either, as some of the pure plays did. Following the burst of the bubble, and the timing of the AOL acquisition was pretty good. Valuations were still strong. So I certainly have no complaints about the process. The one funny story a little bit is that when we first started talking with AOL, of course we approached AOL as we did with the other search engines and large web portals. We approached them as a customer and said, hey, boy, there's so many ways that mapping and routing can fit in what you're doing with real estate and travel and many other things that AOL kind of had on their portal. And we said, you really should pay us a lot of money for this, because we'll be giving a lot of benefit to you and your customers. Meanwhile, at the same time, they had prepared their presentation to us, and basically it was the exact opposite. They thought the relationship was would make sense, that we would pay them a lot of money because they would give us access to their huge customer base, and we'd be able to monetize that huge customer base. So it was just kind of interesting that we approached it from kind of two opposite ends, and probably the one way to resolve that was through an acquisition, because obviously we were not willing or able to pay them what they thought, and what they thought they should get, and they weren't interested in being a traditional customer. So that's kind of how things, I think, ended up on the acquisition side.
Yeah, that was sort of the mood that AOL was in towards the end there, that you pay us for the privilege of getting in front of our users.
Right, exactly.
Okay, so I'm gonna reframe again. So where we are now is you discover that taking maps and putting them on the web has this intense and really successful consumer interest and consumer application. And we've mentioned also that you can see coming down the road is mobile computing. What we now think of as smartphones, but at the day were PDAs and other early handheld devices. But there's a third thing coming down the pike, which is consumer GPS. So can you tell me about consumer GPS and how this is going to tie into what comes in the 2000s?
Well, yeah. I mean, first of all, I guess when you refer to consumer GPS, I assume you're referring to personal navigation devices.
Well, you tell me, because a lot of. Go ahead.
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, it's interesting because the word GPS, I mean, that has come to mean something now that's in common kind of parlance, that is goes beyond kind of what it means literally, which is the global positioning system, which is the way that a device or anything can tell where it is by connecting to this satellite that can figure out your latitude and longitude. I mean, that's all
right,
GPS
right.
is. So now obviously, in order for when you're sitting at your laptop, you type in an address. I mean, this is the way MapQuest and other things worked, and that's how. And if you wanted to do directions, you type in one address and another address. But in a mobile device, you want the device to be able to tell you, where it is, and especially if you're giving directions dynamically, so that as you're traveling, you're getting turn left, turn right,
exactly.
Turn left, turn right at 60 miles an hour. The vehicle or the device needs to know exactly where it is. So I think that's all kind of what's commonly referred to, I guess, as consumer GPS, right?
Well, so, or just the everyday person having access to this technology, which used to be classified basically at the beginning, but also only in the hands of the government originally.
Right. So obviously, yes, this was a government paid for the launching of the satellites, and always had and still has a higher accuracy way of using it than the civilian signals, which allow a less accurate but still very, very useful kind of use of it to determine position. So I think, and you can sort of see the pattern. I mean, the pattern matched the pattern in handheld devices or cell phones or handheld communications, or what happened with PDAs, which is things started out with a dumb, single-purpose piece of hardware. So the early days of and I'll call it personal navigation. The early days of personal navigation were, a GPS, and I guess the first days were I'm trying to remember now, the bad old days when you had what was called a GPS puck, which was a GPS receiver that had wires that attached to your PC. And you could sit there in your car, and I remember doing this and trying not to crash. You could sit there in your car with a laptop on the dashboard with a GPS puck on a wire hanging off of it, and with like a CD-ROM based mapping system running it and being able to calculate your route. So obviously it was extremely clunky, unreliable, slow. But all the technology pieces the ability to calculate your location, the ability to calculate the route and recalculate the route if you go off of the route. That was all there. The map data was there. It was just putting it together in a package that was not a kludge of wires and connections and so on. That's what, and really TomTom and Garmin, I mean, were able to come up with something that was a consumer-friendly way of putting that all together. But even, what they did in the early days was an unconnected device. I mean, it did not require any connectivity to the internet.
Right.
All the maps and everything was self-contained in the unit. So it wasn't until later, really until almost the days of smartphones, that you really, also had the connectivity, which then allowed you to do things like also know what the traffic conditions are in real time, which you couldn't do without connectivity of some type.
So you
and I just add one more thing.
Sure.
I mean, sort of in parallel with this on the personal side, the car companies, at the high end car companies, were of course embedding mapping and navigation into the dashboards of their cars. Albeit for $2,000, as an add-on for your
Right.
to your car. But they of course also had the ability to tie into the car's internal systems to even have more accurate determination of position and so on, in a sort of a smoother user interface. But that was also happening.
Well, so I wanted to say you in the 2000s you work with a company called Webraska, and you're also at Navtech, which, as you said, was later acquired by Nokia. But so the industry now is exploding. That it's not map tech. It's like you said, navigation tech is becoming an industry in and of itself. And does the industry, do people like you see that this is moving towards a place where it's absolutely personal navigation? It's knowing where I am on this planet at this exact second in time and how to get to where I want to go, and that's where the future is heading.
Yeah, I think not only knowing kind of where you are at this second in time, but I think where a lot of the improvements are happening and will happen are more around, what are all the different possibilities out there in terms of being able to, not only get from one place to another, but to decide, where to go, based on what your need or desire is at that moment in time. And then all the different ways that you can get there. What's along the way that things that you might have an interest in. Making sure that the information that you're given is the information that's really important to you, which could include stuff that's around whatever advertising or offers or better yet, content that's actually useful in that context, and the context includes location. In other words, what's relevant where you are, but also what's relevant, like in terms of the activity that you're doing. What your intention is. So a little bit more, connected to the context of your day, what's happening, and the ability to, of course, to handle all modes of transportation, which we're certainly seeing a lot of progress on now with mass transit, pedestrian, cycling, sharing rides, etc. So I think all of that is kind of coming together.
So,
and it's actually I think something that people are expecting and expect to have.
So navigation technology is absolutely not a mature technology. There are still a bunch of vistas to explore, is what you're saying.
Yeah, I absolutely believe that. And I think a lot of it is, it's not just an isolated part of, an isolated function that's not connected to everything else that, is happening in your life in terms of your social connections, what your shopping behavior, your needs, all of that. So I think that connectivity and the understanding of context is where a lot of exciting developments are going to be happening.
A few more questions, and then we'll wrap this up. But
Yep.
most consumers, in the consumer mind, Google Maps is what everyone thinks of. And so I'm just curious what you thought about what Google has achieved with mapping and where they are today vis-a-vis the industry in general.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think they've accomplished a tremendous amount. I mean, they've raised the bar extremely, high to anyone entering, and also have contributed to popularizing and making their tools available to anyone who is planning a service that involves maps and location, and have made it very easy for people to access their technology. So they keep raising the bar, which is fantastic. They make it available to third parties, which is also fantastic. What's a little less fantastic is the fact that, of course, they have a very, very big built-in advantage with, since search is still such an important way for people to kind of enter location, where you start with a search to find something, and then you want to, get the directions of the map. They have a very, very strong kind of built-in advantage in that respect. So on the pure, let's say, mass market consumer, especially kind of mapping, meaning kind of the solution that can satisfy 80% of the world's needs. They are very, very difficult to beat, and it makes sense to use them as much as possible for anybody who's entering this business or trying to do something to innovate on top of what they've done, rather than to clearly reinvent the wheel. On the other hand, there are some open source things and some other innovative things that are a little bit different than what Google does. And people continue to innovate and will continue to do so, which is great, because there are certainly a bunch of things that Google does not do, either because it's not part of the mass market and it is too specialized, or they're just some things they haven't gotten to yet, I guess.
Well, and actually,
I don't know if I answered your question or not.
You did, and actually, kind of in a similar vein, in the way that now we're promised this bright future of self-driving cars and things like that, so that navigation tech is absolutely going to be central to what seemingly will be this completely new industry and things like that. I'm not going to ask you to try to map out for me like how that'll shake out, but I'm just, is there going to be some sort of like one standard mapping technology that's the gold standard that everyone uses? Is it still going to? Again, I just said that I wasn't going to ask you to map that out, but I'm just curious, like how you see navigation tech evolving if we do get to a world 10 years from now where we have self-driving cars and things like that, and so that navigation tech is almost the key, most valuable component of this new technology.
Well, yeah, I'm glad to hear you say that. I don't think there's going to be one gold standard of technology that people will, sort of adopt as kind of a standard. There are too many different interests and actors involved. Obviously, if we're talking about cars, there are the car companies, the OEMs, the networks themselves that are needed to, for the communication piece and certainly want to be involved. There are the device companies, And then there's Google, who certainly like to be, if Google is going to have their own cars, there's certainly plenty of companies that are going to want to compete with them, and those companies will not want to have Google inside of their cars, being the control center of their self-driving autonomous cars. So there'll be certainly, I think, continued pressure and incentive to have independent solutions that and some of which will be sort of the Switzerland type, that could work, that don't compete directly with other players.
Right.
And then there's and that's kind of the role that the HERE or NAVTech, people have provided, and that's going to have to continue. So the way I would see it is there will be 3 or 4 companies like Apple and Google and others who on the tech side who will enter into this space with a full vertical solution. Everything from call it the device, which could be the car, to the operating system, the application, etc. And then there are people who have one part of it, but contribute that to what ends up being inside of, let's say, a vehicle, and they'll be competing head to head. I think there's room for people coming at it from all those directions, just like we're seeing with connected watches today. And you have tech players, and then you have some of the old line watch companies with their own connected watches, and then you have some new entrants, who have similar products because the embedded technology that they need to have to compete is available. The same thing is going to be true on the mapping and navigation side.
All right, 2 final questions. The first one, the easiest one. The second one, the harder one. So what are you up to today, and what are you working on? What are you excited about? Just tell me what you're doing today.
Was that the harder one or the easier one?
That's the easier one, I'm assuming.
No. Okay, this is the harder one. Well, what I'm doing today is I'm sort of half of my time I'm involved with a very exciting software company that's based in Europe. It's called PTV Group, and it develops software for modeling the infrastructure of transportation and movement, which includes highways and mass transit systems and pedestrian systems, and actually it tries to be able to create predictive models of what future conditions will look like under various different scenarios. So, being able to kind of test out what the impact of closing a lane of traffic or adding a new metro stop or adding a new bus line, will be on a city, and is also involved in similar kind of modeling and optimization of freight movements, which include truck and train and various other modes. So it's kind of applying very high level business intelligence and modeling to the field of movement of goods and services and people. So I'm pretty excited about that. And the other half of my time I'm spending with young companies in various stages of startup who are in various parts of the mapping and navigation space, doing interesting things. Everything from real estate to vending machine technology that will help bring people who have a need with the physical goods that could satisfy that need. So I'm also involved in some geographic aspects of cybersecurity and privacy protection, and I have a nonprofit called Spatial Justice, which is about trying to provide tools to and help to nonprofits who believe that they're victims, they're organizations representing victims of injustices based on where people live.
Oh, wow.
In other words, based on location. Yeah.
Hmm.
So that kind of fills up my weeks.
All right, so this is the final question that I assumed would be the harder one, but let's see. I always end by asking people to look back. Usually it's on 20 years. With you, it's 30 years of when you come out of college and you have this degree that your parents are like, what are you going to do with? But it turns out now, 30-odd years on, that it turns out that mapping and geography and navigation tech is so crucial and key to the modern technology industry and the future. Do you feel a little bit of vindication? Like, I picked the right horse drawing those maps in school was really, I was right all along. This is interesting stuff.
Yeah, I wouldn't say, I thought you were going to say, do you feel like you were lucky?
If you feel lucky, then you can express that.
Yeah, well, yeah, I do feel, I certainly feel lucky in terms of timing, because, as you alluded to earlier, when I graduated, I kind of knew what excited me. I did not have any, I was not kind of prognosticating or forecasting, how things would end up developing. I mean, clearly the web and a lot of other things, I mean, those were just not really envisioned. Technology was, digital stuff. I mean, I knew that the future was digital. That was fairly clear even back then. I didn't know how that would manifest itself, but I knew I wanted to be involved. I mean, and I think that's kind of the way I look at it. I wanted to be involved in how this kind of evolves, and I've been lucky enough to to have been involved and continue to feel that way as well. So I don't feel vindicated because I never said, hey, this is the way I envision the future, and you guys believe me or not. It's more of this is what I really got excited about, and felt there would be a future, although I didn't know exactly what it would look like. But and I think that's probably not that untypical of how these arcs actually turn out. If it's something that you feel excited and passionate about, and you stick with it, it may not evolve exactly the way you think it will. And in fact, that's why I think it's best not to hang your hat on a very specific way that either technologically or business wise you think things are going to happen, but to be able to be there as the trends and the enabling technologies happen and take advantage of them and weave your way through that. I mean, that's been really the fun part. We've talked a lot about CD-ROM and GPS and devices, and I mean, things have been changing so rapidly, and it's kind of been like stepping stones, where the stones themselves are kind of moving, and you're trying to get across the river there, and it's fun.
Well, just by doing this project, it's sort of driven home to me that the key thing about the technological revolution of the last 20 or 30 years is just that there's data out there in the world, in the universe, and all that's happened over the last 30 years is we're just making that data available instantaneously. Whatever that data is, hitting someone's thought, what the temperature is in Paris right now, where I am on the planet, like that's what it's all about. And so, yeah, I mean, maps and navigation tech it makes sense now that we see that it's so key to everything that's been happening.
Right, exactly.
Well,
I think you said it very well.
Barry Glick, thank you so much for remembering all that, giving context to that. I feel like that this is the story of navigation tech and how it plays into tech has been sort of underreported a little bit, and so I'm so thankful for you coming on the show and laying that all out for us.
Sure, happy to do it, and thanks for hosting, and I apologize for any mistakes I've made.
If this is the first time you're listening to this podcast, please subscribe to us on your podcast app of choice. There's plenty more great internet history where that came from. And if you're a longtime listener, then you know what to do to help us out. Rate and review us on iTunes. Because iTunes gives credit to reviews and ratings, and the more great reviews we get, the more people will discover us. As always, there's more info on our website, www.internethistorypodcast.com. The show's Twitter handle is @NetHistoryPod, and my personal Twitter is @BrianMCC. Thanks for listening.